we get into the proceedings for today, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that we're all meeting on today. Pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Note the unbroken connection to land and sea and to country more broadly that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have enjoyed for over 60,000 years. We would also like to extend our respects to any Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people who are joining today and any First Nations people who may well be listening in to this call this morning. Again, welcome to you all. I'm joining you from Ngunnawal country. The nation's capital sits on Ngunnawal country. It's, I suppose, appropriate in many ways that we're talking about a critical piece of research which attaches to a national strategy for volunteering, an opportunity for everyone involved in the volunteering ecosystem to have a say, to participate and guide the future of volunteering for the next 10 years. And we do that in the final week of a federal election campaign. It's certainly true that elections and politics are not the only way that we can influence the communities in which we live. And this participation in the National Strategy for Volunteering is a critical way of doing that. So for today, we'll be hearing from a couple of speakers, and there will also be an opportunity to ask some questions and participate in a Q&A towards the end. I'm Mark Pearce, I'm the CEO of Volunteering Australia, and it's a pleasure and a joy to be with you this morning. So, Volunteering Australia, as you may well know, is leading the development of the National Strategy for Volunteering. The strategy is the first one in over 10 years. It's an opportunity, as I say, for all Australians and everyone involved in volunteering to have a say and participate in the development of a blueprint for the next 10 years. This particular project is funded by the Australian Federal Government through the Department of Social Services, and we are particularly grateful for their support. It's important to note, however, that this is not a federal government strategy, nor is it a Volunteering Australia strategy. This is a strategy which will be developed and ultimately implemented by the entire volunteering ecosystem. And that's a particularly exciting approach and structure for something which has such significant importance for the broader Australian community. So let me start by introducing our first speaker for today. Professor Nick Biddle, together with Professor Matthew Gray and Charlotte Boyer, have developed this particular piece of research, well, certainly the early insights that we're going to be talking about today, but the research that we're going to be talking about more broadly, which forms a fundamental part of the evidence base for the National Strategy for Volunteering, has been developed by the ANU. Professor Biddle is joining us today, as I say, from Ngunnawal country. I will hand, without further ado, to Professor Biddle to take us through. Professor Biddle.
Thank you. I think I've hopefully unmuted my mic, although 2 and a bit years into a pandemic, it's still amazing how often I forget to do so. Look, thank you for the introduction, Mark, and I would also like to personally acknowledge that I'm meeting on the lands of the Ngunnawal people, and recognise the ongoing ownership of the land in which we're meeting on. Pay respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this video, this workshop, and also thank Volunteering Australia for the opportunity for us to present some joint work. It's joint in the sense that Matt Gray and Charlotte Boyer and I are working on the project in the ANU, but it's also joint in the sense that it's a deep collaboration with Volunteering Australia. So while the results which we're going to talk about, the paper is an ANU paper, it's benefited substantially from the insight, the feedback, the working closely with Volunteering Australia to identify what's interesting, what's important, how to interpret findings, and also what it might mean for policy. So as mentioned, we are this is a nice coincidence, I guess, of Volunteer Week to be during the final stages of an election campaign. It can have a downside, of course, in that there's a lot of policy areas which are being discussed and considered at the moment. But to me, volunteering and the experience of our volunteers in Australia, the impact they have on the general population are as important as any of those other policy discussions. So if we go into the next slide, we can. I'll introduce this part of the project. And give you a little bit of context about the survey, which we're using to help inform the strategy. So the ANU Centre for Social Research and Methods, which is where Matt and Charlotte and I are based, have been undertaking a series of data collections, both pre-pandemic but also during the COVID-19 period. We've been doing this in collaboration with the Social Research Centre, which is an ANU-owned company based in Melbourne, as well as with the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, who with other partners have funded a number of our surveys to understand the changing outcomes, attitudes and behaviours of Australians during the COVID period. And by having a kind of data from pre-COVID, we're able to see what's changed and who it's changed for. So the Social Research Centre manages the Life in Australia panel, which is essentially a set of individuals who've been recruited to undertake monthly surveys on topics of importance to Australia. And the panel context, those who we're collecting data on, it's of adults, although we have asked in previous surveys about the views of those adults on child outcomes. Importantly, we have both an online and an offline data collection. So for those Australians who feel less comfortable to give their data online, they have the opportunity to participate through telephone interviewing. One limitation is it's English speaking only. That doesn't mean we only have those who speak English, but the data collection is undertaken in English. It's longitudinal, which means we undertake data collection on the same individuals and are able to track those people through time. And finally, it's very important to recognise that the survey is probability recruited. What that means is it's not just people who say, oh yeah, I wouldn't mind doing a survey, and then seek one out and opt in to undertaking surveys for pay. People are recruited and invited to participate with incentives to participate both on the panel, but also for each individual questionnaire. And what that allows us to do is to be more confident that we're capturing a representative sample of the population. So not just people who have particular demographic or psychological characteristics, but it also allows us to undertake the standard statistical analysis which is done on these types of surveys. I should also note that while we don't have any data here, that we will be we're in the process of collecting a supplementary data set from what's called a non-probability based panel, which will allow us to draw insights for the smaller states and territories and for some smaller population groups. But the results we're going to talk about today are from Life in Australia and from a rich, as rich data we think as is available during this current period. So some characteristics of our sample, and I'm going to talk about the April survey here. Which is going to be the focus of this presentation. So the fieldwork period was essentially the 12th to the 26th of April, and with most people giving their information early in the survey window. We have about 3,600 respondents, which allows us to make inference about relatively small population groups in terms of their outcomes and their views and their attitudes and behaviours. Because it's longitudinal, because we're trying to interview the same people through time, we're able to look at change at the individual level. So of our April 2022 survey, which is going to form the basis of this presentation, a little under 2/3 had also completed the April 2021 survey, which is the last time we asked detailed volunteering questions. So that gives us quite a large number of people which we can follow through time. Today, I'm just going to give a snapshot of findings, some initial results, which with the paper, which is available through the ANU Centre for Social Research and Methods webpage. But I should kind of note that this is just a very small subset, and there's lots of additional data available. The final thing to note before I get into some data is that we make the survey available for free online through the Australian Data Archive. So if you or your organisation would like to analyse that data yourself, would like to drill into those findings, then you can do so through the Australian Data Archive. You have exactly the same information as we do to draw out your own inferences and to answer questions which are of relevance to you and which we might not have thought of. So what do we find? If we go on to the next slide, which is essentially a summary of our key question, which is essentially whether someone undertook formal volunteering in the previous 12 months. So the dark grey is in the 12 months leading up to the end of 2019, so our pre-COVID data. And then the hollow bar, the middle one, is for April 2021. So it's essentially people who undertook volunteering in the first year of COVID. And then the lighter grey bar is the percent of people who undertook volunteering in the last year. So what do we see? Well, we can see both some patterns across the population, but also some patterns in terms of change through time. So our sample has quite a high rate of volunteering, probably a little bit higher than some other surveys, and that's partly reflects our sample, but also partly reflects the question which we asked. But the question has been consistent through time. And what we find is that there's been, for both males and females, which is on the left panel, as well as for different age groups, there's been a substantial decline in the percent of Australians who undertook volunteer work in the 12 months leading up to that particular survey. So for females in particular, there's been a slight increase since April 2021, but we still now have far fewer people in our sample who are undertaking volunteer work compared to the pre-COVID period. And that's supported by other data, which I'll get to in a second. We can see if you just look at the most recent data, we can see some differences across the population. So females are more likely to have volunteered than males, and older Australians, particularly those aged 55 years and over, are more likely to have volunteered than younger Australians. But for both males and females, and for every age group, there was a decline into the first year of COVID. Some increases, but not anywhere near enough of an increase over the last year to bring it back up to the pre-COVID levels. Why does that matter? Well, let's go on to the next slide. And the next slide essentially summarizes with a bit of text both the change through time as well as the kind of subjective reporting of who changed and also what that means for the volunteers themselves. So a very large proportion, almost a quarter of those who were undertaking volunteering prior to COVID said that they'd stopped volunteering specifically due to minimize COVID-19 transmission. So we asked essentially a range of activities or a range of changes which people have made in response to COVID, and about a quarter of respondents said that at some stage they stopped volunteering. Now, of those who had stopped volunteering at some stage, so that means that they were volunteering pre-COVID, only 38% had volunteered in the 12 months leading up to April 2022. So essentially what we have is a large proportion of people who stopped volunteering, but then only a less than the majority of those people had recommenced by the end of April. And why does that matter? Well, obviously, the volunteer work which people do contributes to the broader community, and we'll talk a little bit about the types of volunteering and the types of activities, but it also contributes to, well, it appears to contribute from our data to the well-being of those individuals themselves. So every survey since pre-COVID, we've asked a question about life satisfaction. So how satisfied do you feel about life in general on a scale from 0 to 10? Essentially, over the period, we've had fluctuations in volunteering, fluctuations in well-being, and the data suggests that changes to volunteering are strongly associated with changes in well-being. So we can look at the two extremes, which is those who volunteered in April 2022, so in our most recent data, and who said they had not stopped volunteering during the COVID-19 period. So essentially those who are able to maintain their volunteering and are still doing so. For them, average life satisfaction was a little under 7. But if we look at the other extreme, which is those who were volunteering prior to COVID and said they'd stopped due to COVID-19 and also had not started again, life satisfaction was about 6.3. So it's pretty hard to get a sense of the scale of that, but that scale is well outside the bounds which we saw from the impact of the bushfires or the impact of COVID-19 on life satisfaction for the population as a whole. So to put this another way, the impact to the individual of stopping volunteering is, in terms of life satisfaction, is greater than the impact of the bushfires or greater than the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic to the life satisfaction of Australians as a whole. And I see there's some questions, and then yes, we do have some pre-COVID life satisfaction data, and we've talked about that in previous publications and in the paper. And so that's kind of two groups. The other two groups are essentially those who stopped and started again, as well as those who'd never volunteered, and they fall somewhere in between. So just to summarize the last two slides, large drops in volunteering, a number of people who didn't return, and then strong evidence for that to have an impact on the life satisfaction of that population. And we can see why that's having an impact on life satisfaction if we go to the next slide, which essentially gives sorry, I've gone one step ahead. The next slide talks about kind of looking forward to the future. We'll get to the reasons for volunteering in a second. Essentially, we ask people about whether they're going to do more volunteering in the future, and about half the population said they're going to, this is of volunteers, said that they'll do about the same amount. A little, about 1 in 5 said that they were going to do a little bit less, and about 30% that they were going to do a little bit more. Why is that important? Well, because we can't rely on our current volunteers to just increase the amount which they are volunteering, which they do. In the paper, we talk about hours volunteered and how that varies. But if you look at the difference essentially between those who said they would do more and compared to those who said they would do less, that is in no way going to make up for that drop in the number of people who volunteered. So we need to find ways to bring people back in or to encourage people who hadn't volunteered in the past. So we asked people who hadn't volunteered in the previous 12 months what their likelihood would be into the future. And only about 9% said they were very likely to commence or recommence.
Yes.
And about 37% said that they were somewhat likely. So that's not negligible. It's not a inconsequential number of people, but there's two policy responses required. One is to increase the number of people who do feel that it's likely, that who feel kind of inclined to start or recommence, but also to make sure that we turn those intentions into actions. And kind of that intention action gap is going to be if we can make sure that those intentions are followed through, then it's likely to at least help kind of fill some of that gap of people who've dropped out. And now we'll go on to the next slide on reasons for volunteering. In my mind, I had a slightly different ordering in my head, which looked at why people said they volunteered and why people said they didn't. And this really gets at why the impact of that life satisfaction. So of those who did volunteer, personal satisfaction, doing something worthwhile, almost 3/4 of volunteers said that was their reason for doing so. So if you lose, and then you've got a third of people who said social contact was a key reason for them volunteering. Now, of course, helping others is important and using people's skills and experiences. But if you see a lot of the reasons why people volunteer, not stopping doing so, you can understand why that has such a large impact on people's well-being. Finally, if you go to the final slide of results, which is the reasons, go back, I was too far forward, which is the reasons for not volunteering. These are the barriers which I think we need to think about and to minimize. So work, family commitments, and we know that during COVID, these have increased, particularly for those who are juggling kind of homeschooling or managing isolation or just trying to return to the workforce. Very few % of people say that they're not interested in volunteering. It's the barriers which we need to minimize, not that everyone should volunteer. Of course, that's never been either our approach or Volunteering Australia's approach, that everyone should volunteer. That's not feasible. But it's those who have kind of barriers in the way, and easing those barriers and making sure that those who do want to are able to. So if you just go on to the last slide, which is a bit of a summary slide, which I won't kind of read in detail. And most of this is kind of picked up in the paper. The final 2 points, though, is the policy challenge is to find ways for those who aren't volunteering or have stopped to re-engage, and also to make sure that those who want to keep volunteering, those barriers don't kind of get in the way. And finally, I just want to mention some additional data collection, which we've done as part of this survey. We'd look at the type of organisation, the type of activity. We look at a range of socioeconomic or COVID correlates of volunteering, and also the expenses people incur as part of volunteering. And finally, what I think is really rich data, we've looked at the subjective experience of volunteering using qualitative data collection on our survey for volunteers and non-volunteers. So I'll finish it there, and I think I'm handing over to Sarah to talk about the national strategy. Thanks, everyone, and I'll try and answer your questions a little bit later.
Thanks so much, Nick. Most appreciated. There are some great insights there, and certainly we, as part of the Volunteering in Australia research project, this is module 1 on volunteer perspectives. There will be another three modules which will comprise the broader Volunteering in Australia research project, which ultimately then goes in to guide and provide some insight into the national strategy as and when that's fully developed. I'll now hand over to Volunteering Australia's National Strategy Director, Sarah Wilson, to provide some reflections on what this research tells us, how it aligns or accords, or perhaps conflicts with the consultation and engagement we've undertaken so far. Sarah.
Thanks, Mark. And I'll be quick because I'm mindful that people probably have lots of questions. But first of all, just wanted to let everyone know that the National Strategy Project comprises the Volunteering in Australia research. So this diagram shows the co-design process we're on. And at the moment, we're over here in the discovery phase. And the Volunteering in Australia research sits underneath that and alongside it throughout the entire project. So the data collection that we do that we've done through the volunteer perspective and that we will do from the organisational perspective will help us build that really robust evidence base. But alongside that, and I'm sure many of you are here today because you've come to one of our open consultations or I've otherwise chatted to you about the National Strategy Project, we have been having lots of conversations with different people in the ecosystem about the current state of volunteering, what they think might need to change in the future and how we can get there. And in reflecting on the early insights from the volunteer perspective in the ANU data that we've got so far, there are a couple of key things that stand out that relate to conversations we've been having with people over the past 6 to 8 weeks. And the first is that we know, and Nick talked about this quite early on, that the relationship between people's working and personal lives is changing. And this is both a challenge and an opportunity for volunteering. In some ways, it means people might be more flexible and available, but it also might have the reverse effect, which is that volunteering, if it's still done in a very formal, traditional way, may be harder for some people to access who work from home more and maybe aren't travelling as much or have caring responsibilities that didn't exist prior to COVID. The second one, and this is something that has come up quite a lot in the conversations we've been having, is that there are still barriers to participation from people from diverse backgrounds and for those experiencing disadvantage. So after today's session, you'll receive the full early insights report and you'll be able to see that people from English-speaking backgrounds, for example, are more likely to engage in formal volunteering than those who are born overseas in non-English-speaking countries. The other really standout statistic from this, and it is it sort of is an indication around young people, is that they're the only cohort in the data from the 2022 wave of this survey that appears to have suffered more of a decline rather than an increase in volunteering. So across all age cohorts, not a single age cohort has come back to pre-COVID levels, but there's been a dramatic decline for young people and that doesn't seem to be changing. And what we've heard from people over the last sort of 6 weeks is that they are finding it challenging to be able to engage with young people. But we also know as a cohort, most young people are casual workers, and they have been particularly affected by the COVID pandemic as well. So there's more of that relationship that we need to explore through this project because they are our future. There are higher participation rates in volunteering outside capital cities. And again, we've been hearing from people who work in regional and remote parts of Australia that the sustainability of volunteering in those areas is under threat. Volunteers in those areas tend to do it as part of community participation and activity. And if we know that there are higher rates there, we need to, again, figure out what we can do to make that more sustainable. And finally, the other thing that we've been exploring through this research and that we'll have some really interesting findings on is rates of informal volunteering. And that's volunteering that doesn't happen through an organisation or group in a really formalised way. And what we found is that, what the ANU found is that just under half of adult Australians reported doing some form of informal volunteering in the 4 weeks preceding the survey data collection. So we know that that rate is quite high. And we know that for people, for example, those that are born overseas in non-English speaking countries, people from interfaith and cultural community groups tend to participate in informal volunteering at very high rates, and we don't have a good litmus test on what that data looks like. And again, we've been hearing from people over the past 6 weeks that they are seeing more informal volunteering in their communities, and that nexus between formal and informal volunteering is something that we're looking at as part of the project. So in a really validating way, the volunteer perspective data has told us that what we're reflecting as an ecosystem is true and correct, but it also does pose challenges that through the National Strategy Project, hopefully collectively we can start to move the needle towards solutions. So I'll hand back to Mark now, but they were just a couple of things where the data and the consultations we've been doing lined up to tell us what more we need to know over the coming months.
Thanks so much, Sarah. So it's over to you. We're joined by around about 200 people this morning. Thank you for your attendance, and we know your interest. We're keen to hear from you. We're keen to hear your questions and hopefully provide some answers. I would encourage you, if you have a question, just electronically raise your hand. Take yourself off mute. I will call upon you to ask the question, and either Sarah or Nick will answer it. I might jump in if I think that there's something I can add. Additionally, if you want to ask a question, you can put it into the chat, and we'll be more than happy to get to those if time permits. This is an extraordinarily important piece of extended piece of research, and of course an opportunity for everyone to participate. So I see that Peter Davis has asked a question. Peter, perhaps if you take yourself off mute and ask your question, we'll do our best to answer it.
Hi, I'm Peter Davis. I'm founder of a group called Blood Bikes Australia. One of the things that I would like to find out is what's your definition of informal volunteering? One of the problems, one of the barriers I see to volunteering is that there is a fear amongst people that might want to volunteer, that they don't want to get involved in an organisation per se. They don't want that stringent barriers, and it's a real, it's from our organisation's point of view, because we don't have those barriers. We're not even really an organisation per se. We're a group of independent volunteers, and there doesn't seem, I don't know what your definition of informal volunteering is. I fear that the 500 volunteers who are in our group in Australia-wide may very well fall into the definition of informal volunteering.
Yeah, so essentially we define formal volunteering. So, and we follow, there's no questions perfect, but we follow essentially the ABS, the Bureau of Statistics question, and so we first ask in our very first kind of volunteering question, we say volunteering work for kind of sporting teams, youth groups, schools, or religious organisations. So there's a few examples. We then tell people to exclude kind of work in family businesses or paid employment, as well as work which qualifies for a government benefit or for educational qualifications or community work orders. So essentially it's reasonably open. So did you spend any time doing voluntary work through an organisation or group? And then we kind of give some examples and then tell people what to exclude. Then when we go to ask about informal volunteering, we essentially say, okay, apart from what you've told us about, informal volunteering is unpaid help that takes place outside the context of a formal organisation, as well as excludes help to members of your household or family members living outside your household. Then we ask whether you've undertaken any forms of activity. And we give a list of activities, so domestic work, home maintenance or gardening, transport, childcare, teaching, emotional support, which actually emotional support was, I think from memory, the second highest in terms of the type of informal volunteering which is undertaken. And then we've got a few which have lower kind of incidents, so lobbying or advocacy, community assistance. So essentially, informal volunteering is work which takes place outside of, activities which take place outside of a formal organisation, but excludes something for, or excludes activities for your directly for your family.
Thank you. Certainly, if you have any questions, put your hand up electronically, and I'll call upon someone to ask. A question that I have, and I suppose I'll talk a little bit about the next phase of the Volunteering in Australia research project, and it speaks to organisations. But this ongoing discussion around formal and informal volunteering is something we hear more and more of. There's clearly going to be some thoughts and discussion within organisations, and I know that organisations are reflecting upon how best they can meet this this emergent trend in informal volunteering. And it's fair to say that informal volunteering has been around forever. It was around long before institutional volunteering and the institutional structures which support volunteering and inter-community more broadly have been around. But it's something we do hear more about. It's particularly interesting part of the consideration of volunteering and volunteering's future as we move forward. And there are lots and lots of things that will fall into that around support and engagement and how you measure. We're talking today about research, and research is so fundamentally important to all of the work that we do. It's important to advocacy, and of course, it's important to being able to frame up a blueprint for the next decade as it pertains to volunteering. Peter, I see you've got your hand up again. Did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, well, I thank you for that. I suppose really what I'm trying to ascertain is for the purposes of this survey, what is a formal organisation? My organisation, would it be classified as a formal organisation when we are really we have no committee, we have no board members, we don't raise any money, we're just a group of independent volunteers. Is that a formal organisation in the idea of the in the ideas of this research? Or
yeah, so sorry, essentially it would be a little bit up to the respondent, and they wouldn't really be that focused on some of the structures which you're talking about, so committees or boards. That I don't think is relevant. I think what really matters from a respondent's perspective is whether there's some coordination, some support, some overarching guidance given by something external to themselves, and it can be really, really kind of light. So it could be, as you said, just an organisation which provides a kind of a network and an introduction and a more of like a coordinating approach. And that would certainly fall under the definition of formal volunteering. So the way you've described your organisation, my expectation would be that if they happen to be in our survey, that your volunteers would say yes, that they are engaged in formal volunteering. But it is a little up to them and a little bit their interpretation. But yeah, so that will be my sense from how you've described it.
And I can just see a couple of questions in the chat that I thought might be worth answering because they are questions that seem to have a similar theme. And I'll just let everyone know that the recording of today's session will be made available on the Volunteering Australia and National Strategy websites next week. And you'll also receive a copy of the Early Insights report from the ANU, as well as the Volunteering Australia summary at the conclusion of the event as well. But someone has mentioned that economic barriers have been identified as part of the survey, and will the national strategy address the policy considerations around the remuneration of volunteers? And it's a fantastic question, because these are all the things that we want to hear from you about what are the most significant barriers. So what we've been able to do through the ANU survey and with the population survey that we've done is actually understand from volunteers what their most significant barriers are. And they have identified that the out-of-pocket reimbursement can be a challenge for them. And we know that. And there was another question about what are we doing about the challenges in regional and remote areas. Things like the cost of transport with the cost of petrol at the moment could be a particularly strong barrier for people who have to travel a long way to volunteer. And so the idea behind co-designing the national strategy is that we get to hear from all of you about what these significant problems are, and then try to co-design solutions going forward. So we'd really encourage people to get in touch with us outside today's event if they have particular questions or suggestions for how the strategy can address some of these key issues. But I'm not sure, Nick, if there was anything else you wanted to say about the reimbursement.
Yeah, so just to say that it's the first time we've asked it as part of our surveys, and that we're certainly really keen to draw in to kind of look into that in a fair bit of detail. The other thing I would also say is one of the strengths of our survey, which will allow us to get some insights into that, is we're also asking about people's own incomes, people's own household kind of circumstances. So then we can see whether some of those barriers, those economic barriers, are particularly acute for those of relatively low income. So in response to that question, I think it's more wait and see, and we'll kind of definitely look into that in a little bit more detail. I might also respond to another question, which I think relates to this, because it can get to some ways around some of these barriers, which is the means or the mechanisms which people have used to undertake volunteering. And while we haven't analysed it in detail, we've had a bit of a look at the type of, so how people undertook their volunteering. So whether they did it in person, at an organisation, in the field, over the internet, or over the phone. So this is an area which we're going to analyse in a fair bit more detail. But still, our initial kind of findings suggest that the vast majority of people, 69% of people, their volunteering takes place at an organisation. So it might be in an office or kind of helping out, depending on the scale of that organisation. Under half of the sample, or half of the volunteers, so 41% undertake their volunteering in the field. 30% have done it over the internet, and only about 17% have done it over the phone. Now that adds up to more than 100, because you can obviously do both. But there is a large percent of people who, when you combine the internet and the phone, so around about a third or so of volunteers who essentially are able to do that in a way with, or have been able to do that in a way with kind of minimising both those COVID risks, and potentially to minimise some of those costs. So what we'll be doing is comparing these to pre-COVID data, as well as seeing whether there's certain types of people who volunteer remotely or in the field or at an organisation.
Thank you both for your responses to that. I think there might be another question in the chat, which I can't see, Sarah. So might I ask you just to refer to that?
The conversation there is so interesting, and Jack is responding to a lot of them, but I can see just generally as a theme, there's lots of questions and comments around informal volunteering. And through the research that we're doing at the moment, but also through the broader National Strategy Project, we are trying to understand that relationship more, what defines informal volunteering and what it might look like for the national strategy to support these different forms and modes of volunteering. And the reality is that there are no black and white answers, because volunteering exists on a spectrum of participation, and there isn't a neat time when something falls into one bucket or the other. So these comments are really helpful for us to understand that this is clearly a challenge out there in the community. And I saw a comment much earlier around what that looks like with spontaneous and disaster volunteering, and the ways that people engage with that. But I did see a hand from Kath, so I might see if Kath would like to ask their question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep, cool. Sorry, I'm using multiple devices. I guess one thing I wanted to raise, I don't know if it's a question, but one thing that does concern me is the fact that COVID is really not over, but there seems to, the narrative has really shifted about how we're not really talking about the fact that we are still in a pandemic. And I'm just not sure where that leaves some of the things that have been mentioned earlier around pre and post pandemic, because certainly what we're hearing in the ACT is that there's still quite a significant impact on some people's volunteering programs because staff are off sick and numbers are still depleted. But I feel as though the national narrative has really shifted and we're not really talking about that anymore. But what's clear to us when we talk with our networks is that it's still very much impacting on people and their ability to stand up programs. Again, it's not really a question. I guess I just wanted to just put that out there because I'm not sure how we tackle that going forward, given that it's such a polarizing issue.
Yeah, so I might give a quick response, and then Sarah, maybe you can follow up with the kind of the policy discussion. I totally agree that there are still a large number of people who are either directly impacted in terms of isolation or not being being infected, as well as those who are worried about infection, and that's continuing to impact on people's volunteering. So one of the bits of work which we want to do and have done previously is use some of our COVID questions, which we have been asking since the start of the pandemic, and compare those to some of the volunteering responses. So is it those who are worried about infection? Is it those who perhaps haven't been able to get vaccinated? Is it those who have kind of preconditions? Those who, for whatever reason, COVID is likely to have a particular impact on them? Are they the ones who are more likely to have stopped and not started, or to be reluctant to think about kind of volunteering in the future? So certainly our data will help draw out those determinants, but the policy response is really complicated because, yeah, the risk has not disappeared, and the risk for particular population groups, those with who are immunocompromised, those who have family or friends who might be immunocompromised, or those who are otherwise at the upper end of the age distribution or in other ways more susceptible to COVID. You don't want a policy which encourages people to engage in behaviour which is going to put themselves at risk. So finding that balance, I think, will be really hard. And obviously the best policy response would be a national one which reduces kind of COVID transmission in the first place. But in the absence of that, I think a careful supports and a careful policy response is required.
Thanks, Nick. I'm mindful of time and aware of the fact that we may not have got to your questions, and I apologise for that. This is a particularly interesting, it's a large, in fact, this survey is the largest survey of its type in Australia, and we encourage everyone to participate in the surveys that will be moving forward as and where they're appropriate for you. On behalf of Volunteering Australia, I'm particularly pleased to announce the launch of the next part of this research project, the Volunteering in Australia Research Project, which is the survey for volunteer involving organisations. We encourage you to participate in that, to answer the questions. You'll see a link in your inboxes at the end of this particular session. For those who are in organisations, we encourage you to distribute this throughout your networks. It's really important for this survey, for this process, and for the success of the national strategy to be representative, to have as many voices as possible represented within this. So when you see the link, hit your email, participate, share it with your networks. We really encourage you to get involved in this process. I want to thank everyone for your time and your involvement today. It is National Volunteer Week, and so on behalf of Volunteering Australia, I want to extend my thanks to you for all of the work, for all of the involvement, all of the enthusiasm that you bring to volunteering, and how that contributes to strong, resilient, inclusive communities throughout this country. Because it's National Volunteer Week, and as part of a campaign that we run each and every year, we wave our appreciation for volunteers, and I'd certainly invite those who are keen, switch your camera on and wave. We'll take a screenshot and we'll put that out onto social media. We think it's a fantastic way of acknowledging the work which is oftentimes invisible and unacknowledged, that volunteers take into communities each and every day of each and every year. This is a small way that we can say thanks to volunteers. So if you're ready, switch on your camera, little smile and a wave. We'll take a screenshot and we'll share that through social media. Fantastic. Thank you all so much. Again, I shall leave you to your days, but...
Sorry, Mark, I'm going to be very annoying and interrupt if that's okay. Just because the chat is going really wild with lots of really fascinating questions about the relationships in the data. And I just wanted to reiterate that there will be a full report from this survey produced by Nick and his team at the ANU. This is just the early insights. So this is just some high level findings, and they'll be summarised on both of our websites, and we'll send those links. But there will be much more data to come, a really richness, and we'll be able to explore a lot of the relationships that people are asking about in the chat. But as Mark said, that volunteer organisation the organisation survey is now live, and that is your opportunity to tell us your thoughts on what we've heard from volunteers. So the link's in the chat, you'll get it in your inbox. Please do the survey. It is a huge opportunity for us. So we're really grateful for your time, and also can't wait to hear from you through this project as it keeps progressing.
Thanks so much, everyone. And Nick, thank you and your team for the remarkable work you're doing.